Good afternoon, Victoria Coates, Dr. Victoria Coates. Thank you very much for a fascinating presentation. The following panel, Russia in the Middle East, Friend of Foe, is a follow-up to a recently published joint study by the IPS and the Kennan Institute at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. This joint study, titled Coping with the Russian Challenge in the Middle East, is a unique project. Why? Because it analyzes the re-emergence of Russia in the region from the perspective of US and Israeli relations, and it identifies differences of perceptions between them on this subject. Accordingly, the study offers a set of practical recommendations for Washington and Jerusalem on common approach to the Russian challenge in the Middle East. Hard copies of this study are available outside for everybody to take after this session. The director of the Kennan Institute, Mr. Matt Rojansky, is with us here today, and we will share some of the insights of this project during this panel. So without further ado, I would like to invite panel members and the moderator, Ms. Smadar Perry, Senior Middle East Editor at the Yediot Ahronot. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I take your permission to invite the speakers, and I'll introduce them first. I don't know the order. Mr. Matt Rojansky is the director at the Kennan Institute, Wilson Center, Washington. Dr. Maxim Suchkov, a senior research fellow at the university in Moscow. Antonia Dimou, who is the director of Middle East Intelligence Unit, Security and Defense Analysis at the Institute in Athens. General Ehud Evental, senior...
Colonel, not general yet.
Okay.
Colonel retired.
Senior researcher at the IDC Herzliya, and last but not least, Professor Dmitry Adamsky at the Lauder School of Diplomacy and Strategic Herzliya. And I myself, I'm a Middle East editor in Yediot Ahronot. Let me start with a question, and whoever wants to answer, because it's open dialogue, and I think that everybody knows what's going on. Let's start with the meeting which took place last week. It is a meeting between commissioners for national security. It took place in Jerusalem. There was Nikolai Petrushov from Russia, John Bolton from the States, and Meir Ben Shabbat from Israel, and Prime Minister Netanyahu was also there. How do you see this meeting? And I mainly want to hear the Israeli, the Russian, the American, and even yours as well. Who wants to start?
The hosts of the Jerusalem meeting should start.
Yeah, I agree.
All right. I think, Smadar, thank you for a question. I think it's part of the broader question which relates to the overall Israeli expectation to what extent Russia can assist Israel to roll back Iranian carpet or Persian carpet in Syria that emerged in the last several years during their civil war. And I think as of now, there are no illusions in Israel with regards to what Russia is willing to do and capable of doing in Syria vis-a-vis Iranian presence. I think that was the main expectation from the meeting and in general, the main expectation from Russia. And I'm sure my colleagues will talk about the report that is outlining it. I think as of now, there are clearly some divergence of interest between Russia and Iran in Syria, be it on the issue of reconstruction of Syrian armed forces and security apparatus, or the issue of reconstruction of Syria, political and economic competition for that, or even the political transition process. But still, I think there are no illusions in Israel. People do understand within the strategic community that more keeps Iran and Russia together rather than keeps them apart. There are general global interests vis-a-vis the United States between Russia and Iran. There are interests in the region, be it in the Caspian region, in Afghanistan, or in the broader Middle East vis-a-vis Salafi jihad, but mainly within Syria. I think in Syria, Russia still needs Iranian boots on the ground. And for this very reason, I think it's very clear to people in Israel that the total rollback of Persian carpet in Iran is probably less possible. The main, and I think this meeting of national security advisors demonstrated it perfectly well, that the main asymmetry of perceptions between Israel and Moscow with regards to Iran is that, as we have heard from General Gilad and from the head of the Mossad, Iran is the main national concern for Israel. For Russia, however, in this very region in the Middle East, the main national security concern is Salafi jihad, radical Sunni actors, and Iran
let's
is its main
Russian
counterbalance for that. And now I'm giving it to my colleague, of course.
Well, thank you very much, Dimou. After exposing all of the Russian interests here, you want me to? Well, I think the meeting was important, as in that it was something that I believe Moscow has been looking for quite a number of years or months, and then now that it happened, there is this view that they may, help stabilize Syria and this kind of broader security in the Middle East. That said, however, I agree with Dimou in that the meeting also exposed some of the existing disagreements between all of the three nations there, and in that meeting, Russia appeared in terms of kind of perceptions, and I'm saying that not necessarily on a confrontational mode as one against the two, the two allies, Israel and the United States, simply because the other party that Russia was going to convey all these messages and what happened in Jerusalem was Iran, and Iran was not present. And as Dimou already mentioned, while for Israel, a number one threat is Iranian ambition for its regional dominance, for Russia, there are its own concerns, and most of them are, and some of them, Iran is perceived as a natural ally, which is, combating Sunni radicalism. But also Russian-Iranian relationship goes far beyond Syria, and I think strategically, Moscow and Iran are kind of strategic singles in their foreign policy. That's why they have to take care for themselves on other fronts of their foreign policy, and they find themselves increasingly siding on many aspects, be it Afghanistan, Central Asia security, security of the Caspian, and some other things. But that, nonetheless, I think it is a helpful format, and maybe that may grow into something big. We'll see what happens there. Because the title of our panel, I'll conclude here, is Russia foe or friend? And I think the question that people are in Moscow asking is exactly the same. Is Israel a foe or friend, or it's too close to the United States that it cannot play a constructive role? I think so for now, there is this view that Israel can play a constructive role, and hopefully this coordination that exists will continue, because taking Israeli concerns is important for the Russian position as well.
Thank you. What about the American point of view?
Well, thank you, Smadar. And I just first want to take the opportunity again to thank Udi and to thank Amos and the IDC team here. I am not going to be able to summarize everything that's in the report, and I brought it with me, so I'll show it to you. Pick up a copy. It's worth reading. One of the insights, though, and you could even say that this was founding premise for the process. Because this wasn't just a report, it's not just a document, it was a process of meetings, discussions, and research over a year and a half, was the recognition that this isn't, in fact, a triangle. That when Israelis asked the question, in fact, on this very stage, although it was on the other side of campus last year, can Israel be a broker of some kind in what was obviously a broken, dysfunctional US-Russian relationship? The answer, you may recall, that we all agreed upon was, well, no, not really. And the reason for that is baked into the conversation that we had and the ultimate result in this report, which is that the US-Israel relationship is unique. It's a fundamentally different kind of relationship, as Max acknowledged, than one that either Russia and the United States could have, or Russia and Israel. No matter how good a dialogue Netanyahu and Putin develop, no matter how many parades, are taking place and so forth. So that was one insight. But how do you translate that then into getting more of what each side wants? And I include in this getting more of what Russia wants. If there was no prospect for that, then the Jerusalem meeting wouldn't have taken place. So why did the Jerusalem meeting take place now and not a year ago or 2 years ago? I think the answer is context. I think the context is changing to some degree within Syria. Obviously, the defeat of ISIS or the near total eclipsing of ISIS makes a big difference. But I also think it's changing globally. If you look at what Russia has wanted in terms of its response to American isolation, American sanctions pressure, and specific American agenda items on the key global hotspots, Russia has actually managed to negotiate for itself a seat at the table on almost every one of the major issues where it's desired to have that. In turn, Russia has broken out of what was apparently a total isolation policy imposed by the Obama administration in 2014, and now has routinely had summit meetings with American and European leaders, and looks set to continue doing that going forward. In fact, we learned just a few days ago that President Trump has at least nominally agreed to come to Moscow for the 75th anniversary of World War II. That was something that was inconceivable just 2 or 3 years ago. So the context has changed radically, enabling a meeting like that. But I think, and I'll just close on this, there are very significant limits on what this three-way conversation can achieve. And the limits do, at the end of the day, have to do with both the situation in Syria itself, where it's not clear that Russia has the leverage it needs to deliver on fundamentally what Israel and the United States are looking for, which is an Iranian rollback. It's not clear that even if the Kremlin was resolved to achieve that it is in a position to deliver it. That's a problem with this bargain. And second is the fact that no one, and I include in this the President of the United States, is able to transform American politics on Russia today. And that's going to be a problem for some time. The atmosphere has softened very, very little in the aftermath of the Mueller report, but it is still a fact that Democrats are more animated and oriented against Russia than they have ever been historically in the post-Cold War period. And it's a fact that the President's position, which I think we heard Undersecretary of Defense John Rood on this stage yesterday said, yes, there are some things we can do with Russia. That is still an outlier position even within the Republican establishment in Washington, D.C. So you have a bipartisan consensus which is very tough on Russia, and you have a very tough equation in Syria, and I think that puts an outward limit on what this dialogue can achieve.
Antonia, you are not an Israeli, neither an Israeli, Russian, or American. How do you look at this today?
Well, I do believe that the meeting of the national security advisors of the three countries here in Israel highlights Israel's policy and demonstrates its success, in fact, in navigating the two countries' interests, and at the same time it succeeded to have
It was a very unique meeting.
a very, very unique meeting, and it also succeeded, Israel succeeded to be part of the superpowers dialogue on the negotiating table. What I do believe is that the quest from the American administration is to put pressure through Russia and its leverage on the Syrian government to withdraw Iranian troops and its proxies from Syria, also to pressure the Iranian regime to minimize its overall influence in the Persian Gulf, where there is tension, as well as to convince Iran to be brought to the negotiating table and to cement a nuclear deal, if that is possible. But what is interesting is what is the request from the Russian side. Russia is looking forward to improve relations with the West. It looks forward to improve relations with Europe. It looks forward for a swift end to the Syrian crisis so it can cash in the chips it garnered throughout the years in the country. And by improving relations with Europe, this is something very important for Russia because of the imposition of European sanctions due to the tensions in eastern Ukraine. Let's not forget that in June 20th, the European Union renewed its economic sanctions on Russia for a period of 6 months, while sanctions on European entities doing business in the Russian annexed Crimea are renewed for an extra year. Therefore, these are issues we have to take into account. However, EU's relation with Russia is more complex than the ordinary wisdom may suggest, in that the security of energy supply of Europe is dependent on Russia. Europe imports oil, gas, and solid fuels. Therefore, as I said, all this stability of the imports to the European Union depends on Russia. Just to give you a picture and a figure, Italy and Germany combined, these countries, they represent almost half of the European imports of energy from Russia.
You will be the last one in this question. What do you see in this meeting of the three advisors?
I think it would not be exaggerated to say that it was an historical meeting.
Exactly.
Israel between the two superpower, sometimes I think we have to be very careful not to be squeezed in the middle. But it was historical, sort of an historical meeting. And the idea, of course, was to present unity between Israel and the two superpowers. And I was struck.
Was there a unity?
This is what I'm getting to. I was struck from Petrushev. He was on record. He was saying that the Iranians are playing a positive role in Syria, something like that. That he was not very happy with Israeli alleged strikes and operations inside Syria. So I think this is a sign of some division that was inside the room. Which brings me to the question of this panel. From an Israeli point of view, is Russia a friend or foe? A friend or rival? And I think, yes, I think from the Israeli point of view, Russia is much more a challenge than an opportunity. The Russians, we have a problem in Syria, a strategic problem in Syria. The Iranians are trying to replicate what the war machine they have built in Lebanon. They are trying to replicate it to Syria. We need to cope with this strategic problem. And the only power that limits our freedom of operation to cope with this problem is the Russians. Now, of course, the Russians they play with all sides. They give us some room to maneuver, even though I remind the audience that in September, after September, we have a few months of quiet, let's say, in Syria, and I think it is related to Russian pressure on Israel. So the only power that limits our ability to cope with this problem is the Russian presence on our superpower on our doorstep on the northern border. This is one. Second, the Russians are supporting very strongly the Assad regime, and they want now that it regained control in Syria. They want to
limited control.
He controls almost. No, not only Damascus. The only part that he doesn't control is Idlib and maybe to some extent the Kurdish areas.
And the south.
Yes, but the Russian wants to rebuild the Syrian military, which is runs against our Israeli interest. The Russian, and we discussed it thoroughly during this joint study that we've done. The Russian, they came to the Middle East. They had a success in Syria. They are trying to replicate the success all over the region. And one of the one of the goals is to push back the American influence in the region. They want to regain, they were kicked out of the region in the middle of the 70s, and they want to come back to the region and limit American dominance in the region. For Israel, American dominance in the Middle East is a vital interest. We don't have other allies except the United States. This is a major pillar of our national security, and the Russians are trying to limit the American dominance, which runs, again, against our interests. So I would conclude that the Russians are much more a challenge than an opportunity for Israel.
Now, this meeting took place last week. A few days later, during the weekend, Israel was sending its aircraft to Syria, and it was hitting Iranian targets. And this was a very shocking, I think, for the Syrians and for the Iranians as well. But Israel usually is taking care not to hit Syrian soldiers or any Syrian presence, Russian presence in Syria. How does it go along? And I would like to start with our friend from Russia.
Well, definitely.
How do you see this?
Right, the strikes, they're not alleged strikes, as my colleague mentioned, they're real strikes. And we know that I don't think Israel disguises its attribution behind these strikes. They do put Russia in a difficult situation. And I do understand the argument that Russia is either is a challenge or a solution. But on many of the points that my colleague brought up, I think Russia is able and does play a more constructive role than what other alternatives could have been, including the reforming of the Syrian army. Well, believe me, it's better for Israel that Russia does the reforming of the Syrian army than the Iranians. On the strikes issue, that definitely has been a major irritant in Russia-Israeli coordination and relationship, because it does put Russia in a more difficult situation in its interactions with the Syrians and Iranians. And I think there is this kind of bitter disappointment in Moscow anytime this happens, even though I understand there is a due coordination behind these strikes. At the same time, at the official level, Foreign Minister Lavrov has been rather mild in his reactions, saying, and I'm almost quoting him on this, he said, we first need to establish the facts, what happened, and then we'll see. I think the real red line comes when and if, God forbid, any of the Russian equipment or Russian military personnel get hurt. And I'm not saying it's going to immediately escalate, which was the case when the Russian plane was downed and the Russian military attributed to the quote-unquote Israeli provocation, even though it was the Syrians who downed the plane. But I think it is one of these things that will kind of move us higher in the escalation level and make political interactions between Moscow and Jerusalem more complicated in this. While I do understand some of the concerns that Israel has vis-a-vis Russia's interactions with Syrians and Iranians, I do think Russia is able to play and does play a constructive role in being a sort of an airbag between Iranian militias and the Syrian forces in Israel, and acting in a more kind of restraining mode, which is seen, as my colleague mentioned, as a bad thing. I think it's actually a good thing, because if there was no this restraining mode, we would have been in a major war by now.
Do you think that Russia was delivering messages, Israeli messages in Syria?
Can you reframe your question? What exactly?
Do you think, I don't know if you know, but do you think that there were any Israeli messages which were delivered to the Russians and then it was distributed to some sources in Syria?
Well, I think there is this military channel, and my Israeli colleagues would know better probably if Israel communicated something. I think they did. It's just that, you know, until I say there are some, and I mean, there is of course a public reaction, right? You don't expect Russia not to say anything when Syria gets bombed. But then the degree of this negativity varies depending on what was hit and, you know, whether the sensitive targets to the Russians were engaged. So in this case, as I mentioned, Russia's message was milder than usual, but even in the Jerusalem meeting, Patrushev mentioned that these strikes is something that causes a problem. And if we are in for kind of political engagements on this, there should be some, you know, way to go about them.
Anyone wants to? Yes.
Yes. Just as a follow-up, 3 brief observations. First of all, I do agree with my colleague from IDC, with Udi. However, Udi, I think that if we situate the current Russian strategic behavior in the broader historical context, for example, you made the reference to the Russia in the region during the Cold War, the Soviet Union, I think today Russian policy is much more constructive towards Israel than it was during the Cold War. That's number one. I think that the current Russian policy is tremendously sophisticated when compared to the Soviet foreign policy in the region. Russia is trying intentionally to position itself as part of the problem and also as part of the solution. Your remarks and Max's remarks right now basically illustrate that. But Smadar is asking a very important question. What happens, for example, if the Third Lebanon War breaks up or the First Northern War breaks up? What happens? What is going to be the Russian reaction? That's the question that preoccupies many people in this country. As of now, we have heard it here on this very scene today and yesterday. And I think that the range of Russian reactions depend on the Israeli strategic behavior and on the damage that Israel inflicts on their Russian allies and also the length of the campaign. And the range of these reactions can be from...
Who are Russia allies?
And the range of these reactions can range from declarations of protests up to very concrete moves that will limit Israeli space of maneuver and the space of maneuver even of Israeli adversaries. Russia can deploy its defensive weapon systems together with its crews and blur the line between these weapon systems and the weapon systems of Syrians, Iranians, and Hezbollah. Russia even, and I think it should come as no surprise, can delegate some of their authority to use electronic warfare and air defense systems to Russian private military companies that will enable them to operate from the position of plausible deniability. And Russia can even deploy some of its systems and provide advanced arms and intelligence information to its allies in the region if it thinks that they are under attack. So I think the bottom line here is that Russia is going, first of all, if this war breaks out, to let all the parties of the conflict bleed a little bit and to weaken all the parties of the conflict. It is probably also going to limit the space of maneuver of Israel, but also of Hezbollah and of Iran and of Syria, and it will try to position itself as the only effective broker of ceasefire during this war, which is exactly corresponds with your point of competing with Washington, D.C. in terms of relevance as far as this war can be concerned.
1 minute, I want to answer. I totally agree that the Russians can do much more damage than they are doing. This is obvious. They haven't transferred the control of the S-3 and S-300 and S-400 to the Syrian regime, for example. So they keep the situation they try to keep the situation in balance, but they give the Iranians a freedom of action. Otherwise, Israel wouldn't have to act in Syria, yes, according to foreign reports.
Yes.
So they give a lot of room to maneuver for the Iranians to bring into Syria weapons, UAVs, rockets, missiles, etc. And if you look at the broader context,
then the Israelis are hitting them.
Yeah. Allegedly, and then they have to. And then I want to go to the broader perspective is,
yes,
we have a crisis raging in the Gulf between the United States and Iran.
Yes.
And where do you find the Russian in this crisis? Supporting the Iranians on the nuclear front, on the friction in the Gulf. my colleague Suchkov is not, doesn't agree, so this is a vivid discussion, but I'll stop here, thank you.
Well, that's what I call sophisticated approach to the regional foreign policy. That's exactly what they're doing.
Yes, and when it comes to Russian involvement in the region and in regional conflicts, I think it has real limitations due to economic constraints, the ongoing conflict in Syria, and the fear of Russia of being permanently entrenched in regional conflicts. But by being in Syria and by creating a very uneasy alliance with the Iranians on the ground, Putin succeeded in that no matter what US administration is in Washington, they will have to talk to him. Talking to the US is very important to Putin. Let me say it literally speaking that the sun in Moscow seems to rise and set in Washington.
Yes.
So I think that I think Dima is correct that Russia's approach is less constitutionally or ideologically hostile to the Jewish state than it would have been during the Cold War. That shouldn't be a controversial statement. It's also, in some respects, more sophisticated precisely because of the lack of that automatic hostility. But there is, at the very same time, and to some extent for the same reason, a ceiling on what it means to have Russia as a broker or what it means to have Russia as a problem solver that is not the same ceiling that would have been the case with a Soviet superpower or that is the case with the United States and Europe together, say the West today, which is Russia's ability to move the scale goes mostly in one direction. In other words, Russia can limit Israel's ability or someone else's ability to operate militarily. It can muddy the waters of attribution. It can raise the stakes in the military space tactically on the ground. But it can't deliver peace. It has attempted to bring the parties together. Politically and diplomatically, it doesn't have the muscle to deliver a sustainable peace settlement. We'd like them to do that. We'd love to see them do that. Second, Russia doesn't have the resources by itself or at all to deliver on reconstruction in Syria. That's something that only the Western world and, frankly, the Sunni Arab friends of the Western world can come in and deliver. Russia won't be a broker in making that happen. It can either make that very difficult, or it can step out of the way and potentially benefit by default. And third, when it comes to Iran, and this is the most immediate problem, the things that Iran wants, or the degree to which Iran wants those things, don't match what Russia can offer it to get Iran to pull back in Syria. And now I'm going out farther on a ledge than we do in the report. This is just my personal analysis. But my sense is what Iran wants, and you see it in all of the rhetoric that's been triggered by the American pullout from the nuclear agreement, is it wants a kind of global recognition of its status. It wants a regional hegemonic position where it can creep forward a little bit and consolidate its gains. But globally, it wants to be out from under isolation, and it wants a recognition that it is one of a handful of major, G20 type powers, if you will. And Russia is not the party that can deliver that. In fact, Russia itself is suffering from an isolation from that. It's just now getting back into the tent. But it has been suffering from that very same kind of isolation. So all I'm trying to say is, as a broker, as a partner, it may be that Russia's operating more effectively and in a more sophisticated way. But there is an enormous, significant limit on what it can deliver. And I think Israel recognizes that limit. And that's why Israel's engagement with Russia also has to remain limited.
I think even Russia recognizes its limits of power. Yeah? So.
I don't think that Russia minds being isolated. But my question is, after Syria, do you see, and this is addressed to all of you, do you see any Russian plans to be in Iraq, in Lebanon, in South Africa, even in Egypt? Do you see any idea of, yes?
Well, if I may, there's a popular intellectual exercise anywhere, be it in Moscow or in European capitals in the United States or here in the Middle East, whether Russia has a strategy or it does not have a strategy. And if there is one, I have not seen that, but I just, for the sake of argument, say it has a long-term vision. And what makes me think this way are three things, and that's some of the areas where Russia is engaging in the Middle East more than in others. And the three areas are, one is arms exports and building kind of military technical relationships with regional powers. And that is one area that seeks to address a long-term challenge of the Middle Eastern stability and security. That is, given the current unresolved conflicts and a lot of the conflict dynamics in the region. And by, both establishing diplomatic relations or deepening down on diplomatic relations and establishing military technical cooperation, you have this, you're filling in this important niche. The second thing is that Russia carefully observes some of the way climate change, for instance, affects production of crops across the region. And the analysis is that in the long term, there'll be more droughts and then there'll be more hungry people basically across the region, and Russia is an important agricultural exporter and provider, including for water resources for a lot of these things. And that is also kind of in conjunction with that is the thing that the oil and gas in the region may be, more challenging in the long term, and then there is this focus on the development of nuclear energy across the region, and Russia is promoting this aspect as well. And the third one, Russia is looking at some of the current population dynamics as a way to see how social changes may move, how different divisions within political Islam may move, something that is important to Russia's own in domestic politics and Russia's own kind of domestic fabrics. And on all of these fronts, you see the importance of the Middle East in strategically, that goes beyond Syria, that is not necessarily focused exclusively on the security agenda. And that, I think, is kind of a vision that Russia currently pursues. Now, the question is, of course, Middle East politics is akin to gambling. You may be doing well and enjoying it until a point you lose all your stakes. So you really need to know where to stop. And there is a question of matching resources with your ambition. But for now, I think there is this kind of view that there is there. But I mean, and I'll conclude on that. Ultimately, I think Russia's goal is in a way similar to that of the United States, although for a different reason. Both are trying to find a formula for a presence in the region that can allow a relatively limited engagement, but that can generate enough power and influence. For Russia, it's mostly the question of resources and the restraints that Matt mentioned. For the United States, it may perhaps be a matter of strategic priorities in the Asia-Pacific region. But fundamentally, the Middle East is too important to leave it to itself, but then too heavy of a burden to carry.
Yes.
Well, yes, I agree with Max in that I believe that Russia does not have the ability to, and not the willingness as well, the political willingness to engage in other regional conflicts. Syria is enough. Russia has to maintain its interests and solidify its interests in the country. It maintains 2 military bases. Very recently, the military agreement that was renewed when it comes to the naval base of Tartus has been finalized, and it allows the Russian Navy to expand its technical support and logistic base in the country. And it also allows for the visits by Russian ships in Syria's ports, territorial waters, and internal waters. And most significantly, Russia will try to cement its energy investments in the so-called safe Syria. This is particularly evidenced by the fact that energy giant Gazprom has taken over exclusive oil exploration and drilling rights within Syria's exclusive economic zone from Russian state Soyuz-Neftegas, which in 2014 signed an agreement with the Syrian government. And at the same time, we see that Syrian companies, they are leading energy investment. However, due to American and European sanctions, it is deemed difficult for the Syrian government to find partners for its crude exports.
Let me just go to downstairs, to Saudi Arabia, the Gulf countries. Israel is there under the table. The United States is there. Can Russia be absent? Can Russia can afford not to be there? I'm sure that they are following what's going on. Yes.
Yes, I think, first of all, Dima, I wanted to say Russia is very sophisticated and very successful, cost-effective. Its foreign policy is very cost-effective. I don't say
We can stop
it's
here,
not.
that's fine.
It's not, and in the Middle East, they try to enhance their presence and influence, not only in Syria, they are trying to expand. You find them with all those contacts with Haftar in Libya, and you talked about the Gulf. 2 days ago, the UAE declared that it said it cannot blame Iran for the attacks against the containers and the oil infrastructure in the Gulf. And who was standing next to, I think it was the Emirati foreign minister, who was standing next to him? Lavrov. So they are there. And they are trying to expand their influence. They are trying to be there, and everywhere you will find the diminishing American influence. And I think the recent messages, the American messages in the Gulf, are a little bit weak. And once you have a crack, the Russian will try to increase their influence and go into it.
Smadar, this is an excellent question. I don't think that I have an answer where exactly we're going to observe Russia, but I think in the Middle East. But I think what I can offer you is 3 characteristics of their strategic behavior. So wherever they do what they do, I think we're about to see 3 things. First of all, Moscow is probably going to behave along the principle of controlled tensions to make sure that the tensions in the region are high enough to ensure its role, but not as high as not to endanger their interest and assets. That's number 1. Principle number 2, they are probably going to behave as an even-handed broker that is trying to engage all parties involved in these regional tensions, and at the same time to signal to each party of the conflict, be it Iran, Israel, or whoever it is, that the limits of their freedom of maneuver are limited by Russia. And finally, if Russia is forced to intervene militarily, as it did in Syria, wherever it is in the region, probably Russia is likely to behave along the principle of reasonable sufficiency to make sure that it is all the time operating in the golden range between overshooting and undershooting, investing minimum of military power in order to benefit or to generate maximum of strategic benefits.
Thank you. Just the 2 of you, please, very short answers to this question.
Well, look, I would say that there are 2 concepts that are in tension with any broader Russian engagement in the Middle East. One is crowded spaces. Even if it's true that there are vacuums, there are limited vacuums when the Americans pull out from a particular role or where our active engagement flags off for a little while. These are incredibly crowded spaces with local actors, with regional actors. There's always someone who wants to get into the business who has interests. And when the Russians come in, they often come in with a narrow set of goals. And whether they realize it or not, they end up triggering reactions on another set of issues. That is in tension with the need for risk mitigation. The entire Russian-Israeli-American dialogue around Syria is fundamentally a risk mitigation dialogue. The United States and Russia has its own deconfliction dialogue, which is intended to mitigate risks. When the Russians expand into crowded spaces, risks will increase. That is an inevitable physical fact, and the need for risk mitigation, therefore, will increase, which means dialogue. It's an imperfect tool, but it's what we have.
You will be the last one, but
really quickly, I would just add that among the principles that my colleagues mentioned, I think there is one that is in Latin they call primum non nocere, and it's a medieval medical principle: do not further harm. You're trying to approach this carefully, and see what happens, engage all the actors, but do not rush to cause harm immediately. And until that is the case, I think Russia will have been continuing to be doing relatively well for itself on balance, even though there's definitely no elevator to success in this. Everybody would have to take the stairs.
Thank you very much. Time is
Thank you.
finished.
Thank you.
Thank you.